Well, welcome and good morning to everybody in the room. As Ken mentioned, this is developing climate resilient infrastructure for sustainable future in the mountain states. I want to take a quick moment to just thank Ken and Infraday for putting on this program, the whole program for the day, and specifically giving us this opportunity on the panel. We'll jump into, in a moment, we'll jump into quick introductions. One of the things that was interesting about what Drew mentioned in one of his questions is that sustainability, resiliency, right, terms that have been used for a long time. And he's like, until recently, I'm not sure I necessarily knew what they all meant, right? And it's interesting on this panel with it being specifically targeted towards resiliency, and that there's this whole debate, which is resiliency and sustainability the same thing? Are they replaceable? Are they interchangeable? And what exactly is that, and does it mean? And really, from a resiliency perspective, it's all about our ability to adapt to crises and disasters, and building the infrastructure from a physical, a mental, a social, a spiritual perspective to allow for us to be able to adapt as communities and to rebound from those types of activities. And so just keeping that in mind as we go through kind of the resiliency discussions. We got a very diverse panel, as we talked about on the phone, with a lot of different experiences and different organizations and groups and what they do. So we'll have them introduce themselves in a moment. Tom Patterson, CEO with Energy Cap. Just a real brief, shameless plug about Energy Cap is we're a software company. We've been around 42 years. We basically provide an energy and sustainability management ERP platform that allows energy managers, sustainability leaders, finance leaders, and facility leaders to have a single source of truth by which to manage and plan and report out on all of their related data. And from there, we'll go ahead and jump into the introduction from the panelists. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves because I won't do them justice if I start to introduce themselves and their organizations. So why don't we go ahead and start with Liz Cohen.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks so much for inviting me here. My name is Liz Cohen. I am the Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Manager in CASR, Denver's Climate Action Office. Our mission in CASR is to have a carbon pollution-free and resilient Denver for all. And my team specifically is working on preparing our most vulnerable communities to the impacts of climate change, helping to prepare them for those. We are really focusing on things like extreme heat, drought. I heard Angela with Denver Water talking about that issue, extreme weather, so too much and too little water, as well as air pollution, wildfires. So we're really thinking about many of the different threats to Denver and how do we prepare for those. I am thrilled to be here and excited to talk to you about all the different programs and projects that we have, but I'll do that during our Q&A.
Great. Why don't we jump to Alex?
Hey, everyone. Good morning. My name is Alex Stain, Senior Manager at the World Resources Institute, or a think and do tank based out of DC, but we work across the nation on clean energy deployment and helping cities, local entities, nonprofits deploy. So we partner and support federal programs, especially at DOE, and also philanthropic programs that are really interested in decarbonization and resilience at the local level. So Project Pipeline is kind of my jam. I worked at NREL for about a decade on technical assistance for local governments doing projects, supported the New York Joint Field Office during Superstorm Sandy, working with FEMA and cross agencies there, and now been 15 years in the game, and it's kind of like bringing business to you. Let's do the clean energy transition and tee up what that looks like in the most equitable way.
Got James?
Yes, thank you for having me. James Lester, Senior Advisor with the Colorado Energy Office. I lead our transmission and markets work. I also work a lot on developing policy with the General Assembly, getting bills passed. I've been a CEO for just over a year now. Prior to that, I was an advisor at the Public Utilities Commission here in the state. for about 8 years. And even earlier than that, I've spent 2 great years at WRI. So nothing but great things to say about that organization. Our role at CEO is really to implement Governor Polis's policy agenda. And we have very ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals. And that's a lot of what our office does, focusing on decarbonizing the electricity sector, along with electrifying our building and transportation sector. We've historically had a very reliable and resilient grid. However, due to a lot of changes over the past decade, most of all climate change with increased wildfires, increased heat, security issues, grid resilience has been a pretty big factor in a lot of our decisions and a lot of our policies. So happy to dive into those a little bit today.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. I'm Bryce Flisky with Region 8 EPA, and I work under the Safe Drinking Water Act in the drinking water program specifically. So a lot of the funding that I will talk about will be in regards to the water sector. I'm also the cybersecurity coordinator for Region 8, and for this panel, I work in the CREW program, which is the Creating Resilient Water Utilities. So I'll be kind of talking about how that program relates and other also technical assistance programs that the EPA offers. Thanks.
Great, great. Well, thank you, everybody. Appreciate that. Starting off, in light of the fact that from a public perspective, all the discussions are always about greenhouse gas emissions, sustainability, how do we get to net zero? Resiliency doesn't come up a lot, right? When you think about what's publicized out to the markets in terms of the discussions. How do your organizations look at, segment, focus, and prioritize resiliency efforts versus other sustainability efforts that you might have within your organizations? Maybe Liz, why don't we start with that since you're shaking your head?
I think in CASR, that's our nickname for our climate office, we're really working in conjunction with our teams to both reduce carbon pollution as well as increase resiliency. For example, my team, which is pretty new, we work very closely with our buildings and homes team. And one of the things that we're working on is installing heat pumps into homes. And that not only reduces greenhouse gas pollution, but it also provides cooling for people who might not have cooling. And that makes them more resilient because they are not going to have to deal with the extreme heat. So that's one thing that I think that we work very closely with. Another thing that we've been doing is creating electricity resiliency, doing things like installing solar panels on buildings and having backup battery storage, which and those credits, for example, are going to families that can't afford their electricity bills. So it's really building resiliency in community by helping put money in people's pockets, as well as increasing our renewables. So there's a blend. We can work together on those things. They're not always separated.
Right, gotcha. Just curious on that before we move to the next. Do you guys completely budget for and fund separately resiliency efforts versus other sustainability efforts? And how does that process take place from a prioritization perspective?
Great question. So I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but Denver passed a tax, which is the Climate Protection Fund, a 0.25% sales tax that helps fund our office. It brings in between close to like $40 million a year for our climate office. And we have 6 allowable uses for that climate protection fund. I'll tell you what they are. That might help answer your question. One is buildings and homes. Another is our mobility and energy transition. You'll hear from James later. And then we have our green workforce team. So we're helping to build the next generation of people who are working on this issue. We have our environmental justice team. We also have adaptation and resiliency. So we are separate, but we are also within all these other teams. And I think I probably am missing one, and I'll think of it in a minute. James, you help me out? Oh, yeah, we have the zero waste team as well. So we have 6 different allowable uses, and we share that $40 million every year. So
Awesome.
yeah.
I love the lifeline, by the way. That's great.
Phone a friend. I like it. At World Resources Institute, it's fun kind of where we are sitting in a space of like, how do you push decarbonization, sustainability in lockstep with resiliency? So we get to kind of pick and choose, which is a luxury on our end of like, if our mission is to push forward the field, push forward innovation and like theories of change, we kind of tap into those areas, which is nice. So one of the big efforts that we have of like combining essentially that shift and like combining sustainability with resiliency is shifting like a business as usual of what resilience may have been into incorporating clean energy and what that looks like in its different facets. So on our end, we do a lot of work on the transportation side, working with the electric school bus initiative, which we're trying to get 100% electric school buses by 2030. But where does that naturally go in your mind is thinking about resiliency hubs and what's like the V2B, V2G options there. So we've started to pilot different options, different intervention points with local partners on thinking through resiliency hubs and what does that look like? How does that manifest? What are so these MOUs that need to be put in place for agreements to bring like school bus assets to schools as far as like a dispatchable battery system. On the transmission side, we're looking at reconductoring systems. We're also looking at master planning that goes in lockstep with resiliency, public input, and sort of cost benefit and community engagement models there. And working with Excel a little bit in an evolving proposal that's place-based in the Colorado region as well. And then we work hand in hand with local governments that are pursuing specific resiliency hubs and how do they combine and maximize IRA bill funding to sort of dispatch PV plus battery systems, and what does that look like at different procurement scales, and how do they develop their procurement, and how do they put this out to bid in a logical way?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Elizabeth's issues with the city of Denver and many of our cities and organizations have really ambitious electrification goals. Unfortunately, our investor-owned utility here, that Excel, has been struggling to keep up with that demand. We recently implemented distribution system planning at the Public Utilities Commission, which helped, but they were still falling way behind. So this past legislative session, our office worked with Excel, with labor, with the storage and solar industry, as well as an environmental coalition to pass what's known as the Powering Up Colorado Act, which will really make some improvements on what we learned in our first round of distribution system plans, as well as allow a quicker cost recovery for the utilities to get it really ahead of these investments that are really needed to upgrade the distribution grid, to enable electrification and to enable more solar on rooftops with better interconnection procedures. As well as part of the bill also enabled virtual power plants, which when you're having certain areas of the grid that are stressed, a virtual power plant can relieve that and avoid that upgraded distribution investment. 2 years ago, another issue that our office is currently working on, the General Assembly passed a bill that instructed our office to work with the Department of Local Affairs to develop a microgrid roadmap. And this roadmap is looking at the benefits and costs of building microgrids in critical infrastructure in areas of the state that are undergoing a lot of reliability issues, particularly in our rural co-ops. And so we are currently working on a draft of this roadmap, which will not only lay out the benefits and costs of these programs, but also lay out some policy frameworks that might need to be made in order to enable the usage of microgrids.
With our CREW program, the Creating Resilient Water Utilities, I think like what the EPA can really do is provide a lot of educational guidelines for communities to really educate those communities and our water utilities in climate resiliency. So I think that's one of the main goals with the EPA. And through this program, yeah, we definitely provide tools, training, and technical assistance. The technical assistance is always at no cost to the communities or to the water utilities. And once they're finished using the CREW program, we also have an EPA water TA program where we can pair that same community up with a different technical assistance provider. And ultimately, their goal is to kind of help them find those perfect bill grants to apply for, help them through the application process, and really try to get that community or water system funding.
Great. One of the things that I thought was interesting, Liz, is you were starting to describe what you guys are doing in terms of examples of resiliency, is that you were talking about things that predominantly were being done in the built environment. So I guess, where do you guys see the most potential impact for your resiliency efforts and prioritize your time and money? Considering, for example, in the mountain states, taking Colorado as an example, you have the big cities with the hubs that are really built out. You have all this rural area, not to mention you've got the plains and then you've got the mountain regions, right? And it provides for a very different scenario than, let's say, Kansas, right? Where, you know, all land is somewhat created equal. And so is it more impactful right now in the built environment in terms of retrofits? Or is it more impactful in spending resources and dollars and efforts and more of the rural areas and the mountainous areas to create greater levels of redundancy and resiliency within more open space?
So one of the things that our team is really working on is serving our vulnerable populations and our vulnerable communities. That's what our funding goes towards. So one of the things that we do is a lot of listening to find out what our communities want, and try to serve those priorities to serve the citizens of Denver, because they are the ones that fund our program. And you know, we want to make sure that 100 years out, we are doing right by them. So we've heard from community that they want resiliency hubs. We're working on that. My team is doing that. So resiliency hubs combine a lot of the things that you're talking about, both natural systems and built systems. They also want a lot of trees and natural solutions. And we're working on that too. We just received $5 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act to enhance our community tree planting program. So we're going to be planting over 1,000 trees in Denver in the next couple of years. So we're really trying to be responsive to community needs. And one of the things they also don't want is extreme heat and the, like, extreme storms like hail damage and all the things, right? So we're trying to do many different things to try to serve their needs.
Anyone else on that?
Yeah, I would just add, our office also applied for funding under the IIJA, Infrastructure and Jobs Act, what's known as the 401(d) funding. And we've taken a somewhat innovative approach compared to different states for implementing that funding. We have 3 different programs. The microgrids for community resilience, which is led by Department of Local Affairs, which will provide that funding once our microgrid roadmap is out for these communities to really take advantage of that. We are funding utilities for a grid hardening and for small and rural communities that allows these smaller co-ops and municipal utilities to make upgrades such as, undergrounding, vegetation management, reconductoring on their grids. And finally, we have our advanced grid monitoring program, which allows these smaller utilities that don't quite have the funding of our big investor-owned utilities to figure out how they can use their grid more efficiently using drones, LiDAR, and satellites, AI cameras, all the new technologies that are able to really monitor the grid.
Great.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think with Bill and the Inflation Reduction Acts, I mean, one of the big goals was to target rural communities and disadvantaged communities across the nation. And we've been doing a good job at the EPA of doing our own outreach to communities all over the Rocky Mountain states, Region 8. The Water TA program specifically, you know, we really reach out to those disadvantaged communities. We have tools that kind of identify communities across the state that need help. We work with the state of Colorado as well. It's a big challenge for a lot of those smaller systems to apply for grants. You know, they're not aware of what grant to apply for, how to do it. They're not grant writers. So we really kind of help them through that process. And that's why we pair them up with other technical assistance providers who can walk them through that process to get them the funding they need. And that's exactly what a lot of the programs that I work with specialize in.
Great. So staying with you for a minute, Bryce, just from a water perspective, since that's your focus area and you've mentioned it a couple times. You know, considering the fact that especially in the mountain states, you know, we're a critical source of water for much of the rest of the country with where the riverheads and everything start. We hear constantly about natural shortages of water starting to continue to happen, you know, in terms of without any significant threats against it, just our natural population growth and inefficient use. And then now we're hearing more and more about the existential threats of it being the #1 target from a terrorist perspective if there is ever another terrorist attack, which inevitably there will be. What are we doing, or how is the EPA focusing on providing resources and information for other organizations to better protect and preserve the water sources and prepare for, you know, what could come in the not too distant future?
Yeah, I mean, we have the guidelines out right now, and with the Creating Resilient Water Utility Program, we developed a software tool called CREATE, Climate Resilience Evaluation and Awareness Tool. And that tool basically is a risk and resiliency assessment for water systems, so either wastewater or drinking water treatment plants. It's at no cost to them, and it basically identifies vulnerabilities. And we have the same program for cybersecurity as well, where it will kind of tell them exactly what their vulnerabilities are. So now the systems are aware of that. And then they can start addressing those. And then we come in and help them with the funding aspect. But yeah, that, like you said, it's a huge need, and we're continuing to put out material to help water systems.
Great, thank you. So just in the sake of time, I'm going to move to a little bit of a tangent question. We talk a lot about, so far we've talked predominantly about kind of physical and social environment from a resiliency perspective. I think it's a lot harder for most people to contextualize the mental and the spiritual piece of it. In light of the growing mental health crisis, right, and its impact on homelessness, there's so much of a connectivity to creating infrastructure for that, you know, underserved or underprivileged or at-risk community. What are your organizations doing in regards to the mental and spiritual aspects of projects associated with resiliency?
I'll go with the landscape view of things I've seen that might lead towards integration of that thought. So the rise of like the social vulnerability indices as like where to put, and again, I'm just pivoting back to physical assets, but
they're related.
They are related, but like understanding and mapping where your communities are most vulnerable, using tools that are being put out by the White House to understand where your Justice 40 communities are, where your disadvantaged community and frontline communities are, ones that you could overlay different maps of social vulnerability indices on, of where you need to provide services and where the cost of outages really impact the most. So a lot of great work came out of the Grid Modernization Lab at DOE and the Designing Resilient Communities working group that they had to start to plan for that. And they had different case studies and work areas of how do they alleviate that if you're doing interventions that are technical. And then also we've seen the rise of interfaith organizations starting to play a key role, that resiliency doesn't need to be a public agency asset. This could be something that could be housed at a church and working through different houses of worship as well, which is an interesting thing, because if you're agnostically coming at it, where any sort of faith-based institution could play that role in a community, you're starting to see a stitching together and harmonization of, okay, maybe we're not so different if we're intending to serve the public good, which is an interesting avenue that's going forward.
I'll go next. One of the things that we've been doing is really building the community, because and building those relationships, because social isolation often leads to psychological and mental issues. Our groups that do our tree planting and our tree care, it's not just planting, it's, you know, taking care of the tree its entire life. They go door to door and build community. They are part of the community, and the tree and the, hey, would you like a tree, is just a way to start to build community and build those relationships. So we have a couple different community groups that are doing that. We have a Promotores Climaticus group, or I guess it's 5 different groups that we fund that are community connectors that help to build community as well. And our environmental justice team and our communications outreach team really have been doing a great job with that. So I think that communities are resilient if they are communities, right? And they're not just individual people. One of the things that we're hoping is that people will know their neighbors well, you know? So most of the time in emergencies, it's not the city government that helps people, it's actually neighbors that help take care of each other immediately, you know, if something's happening. So it's good to know your neighbor and check on your neighbor if, like, for example, the power goes out, checking on folks that might need extra assistance.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say that our office has a very strong environmental justice focus. One of the big things that we're working on, and others in the state are working on, is how we get more representation of income qualified and environmental justice communities in proceedings of the commission, which will directly impact them. And they've never had that opportunity. It's expensive, it's difficult, it's a long process to get involved in proceedings of the commission, but we are working on rules at the commission that will really help fund and allow it to be much more easier for organizations that represent these underprivileged communities and economically hard-hit communities to have better representation when millions of dollars are being decided upon with our investor-owned utilities.
Great. I'm gonna press you guys. We have about 1 minute left, so I'm gonna press you real quick with one quick question, no explanations, just your simple answer. And that is, what is the #1 inhibitor from your perspective for you and your organizations to achieve and accelerate your resiliency goals? Liz, why don't we start with you? You want to go first? We'll start with Bryce then, since he didn't have. Quick.
I mean, that's tough. I just think it's working with those smaller communities. It's hard for them to really get those funds. So really working with them, getting a TA provider to really identify the best grant available and helping them through that application process. I think it's the #1 goal.
Great. James, you look like you're ready.
Yeah, I would say, along with what Bryce just said, building trust with our rural communities. Our energy office isn't always welcome in some of our rural communities. They don't necessarily agree with the governor's positions and policies, and luckily we do have the Department of Local Affairs that does have great relationships with the communities, but I think building that trust across the state, not just here in the Denver area, is really important for us.
Alex?
When working with local partners navigating, am I pursuing a competitive grant opportunity? Am I using formula funds? Am I using something that's on my fiscal books already? And then how do I stitch it together with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to make this project affordable kind of on day one and navigating that?
Liz?
Getting everybody else to be thinking about resiliency for the next 100 years and planning for the impacts of climate change.
Gotcha. Great. Well, we're out of time. We could probably talk about this for another 2 hours, but I want to thank the panel very much. Great panel, and so thank you very much for joining us. And